Hello and welcome. My name is Jason Draper, and we're here talking about bee biology today. I'm from the Stark County Beekeepers, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about bee biology. For myself, I'm a hobbyist, and one of the things I really enjoy is how these critters live and how they interact with each other, and that's what keeps me interested. The honey got me started, but the life cycle of bees is what keeps me interested. We're talking about biology today because that's an important aspect for all the other things you're going to learn about inspecting hives and how to maximize honey and how to deal with disease and everything else. A little background of biology is pretty helpful to get moving forward with the rest of that. So starting off with the real basics here, what is a honeybee? Well, a honeybee is not a bumblebee, a hornet, a yellow jacket, a wasp, or any of these other critters. In fact, yellow jackets are a hornet, actually. They're not even in the bee family at all, even though they visually look pretty similar to people. People often confuse them and think about bees as being aggressive and being stung by a bee. They use the word bee all the time to describe many different insects, but honeybees themselves are not particularly aggressive when they're outside of their hive. They lose their stinger when they sting you, so they are pretty reluctant to do that because when they do lose that stinger, they die. Honeybees also don't live in any sort of nests like some of these other insects do. If somebody sees a nest, that's typically a yellow jackets or hornets, or in the ground, those are also not honeybees. Honeybees live in existing cavities, typically, whether that's a tree or the eaves of your house or some other cavity. So, like I said, a hive of bees, they live in a colony. You don't see bees just living a single bee by itself. They need a certain size population of a few hundred, couple thousand bees in order to maintain their existence. We call them eusocial. That's EU social, meaning that they're completely and entirely social insects. This also means that there's only one bee, one animal inside their colony that's actually reproducing, and then the rest of the animals assist with that. So there's a lot going on inside a colony. There's typically 3 different genders, castes, if you will. The worker and the queen, those are both female. And then the drone, which is a male bee. And we're going to talk pretty in-depthly about each of these different castes here through the next few slides. So again here, the worker, the drone, and the queen. You can tell that they're significantly different. The queen being a much longer bee, the drone being larger around, and the worker bee being the smallest bee. Now, we're going to just spend just a short time here talking about genetics because I'm not an expert in that, but it's something to be aware of. That female bees have 2 sets of chromosomes, and the male bees only have 1 set. And that means, and that's how they distinguish between the males and the females. And we'll talk a little bit more about how the female lays different eggs, but it's basically that a fertilized egg becomes a female and a non-fertilized egg is a male. We call that haploid, meaning that they don't have two sets of chromosomes, and diploids, which are the females. Again, here's just a photo of 3 different casts on some combs, so you can kind of see how they look in real life there a little bit. So first we're going to talk about the worker bee. Worker bees make up the vast majority of the population of the hive, 90+%. They're female again, they're immature females. They do sting, they don't mate, they don't do any of the egg laying. And they typically live for about 6 weeks. So how does a worker's life begin? Well, it begins when the queen lays an egg inside the cell. Workers then feed that larva inside that comb cell until it fully grows. At that point, the worker seals the top of the cell with wax, and it spins, and the larva spins a cocoon inside its cell at this point. This goes through a metamorphosis, not unlike what butterflies do. And then at the end of its growth, it emerges from the cell as an adult bee. People will call this hatching a lot of times, particularly novice folks, when the bee comes out of the cell, but the proper term there is emerging, because the egg has hatched several days prior, before the larva started to develop. So what makes a worker bee? They have basically the same anatomy as all the other bees in the hive, but you know, you've got antennas, you've got your head, your wings, your eyes. There's large pollen collection areas where they pack the pollen on the back of their legs. This is often called a pollen basket as well. And they have a short abdomen, and then there's stingers on the back of them. And this is a barbed stinger, like a fish hook. So when a worker bee stings you, that fish hook, as such, gets stuck in you and rips off of the bee. This individual bee then dies after that. And that stinger is left in you. There's a little muscle that's left behind as well that will pump the venom from the stinger. So that is a reason why it hurts more. It's continuing to pump the venom in. The other thing that stinger is doing when they sting you is to release a little bit of pheromone, which notifies the other bees in the hive that there's something going on here. The proboscis, that's the tongue of the honeybee. It's basically a long, hollow tube, and that reaches down into a flower to suck up the nectar, and then they can bring that back to the hive. Now, a honeybee's tongue is not as long as some other pollinating insects, so if you're planting any flowers or looking for food sources for honeybees, kind of pay attention to that, because some flowers, the nectar is down too far and the honeybee tongue cannot get to it. So what do worker bees do? They're nurse bees. They're taking care of the other bees, the larvae inside the hive. They'll work on sealing the honey. They'll feed the drone bees. Some of them are taking care of the queen. There's a lot of different jobs within the hive that have to be done at any given time. So what does a honeybee do, and when do they do it? That's kind of determined by how old they are. but this can vary. So typically, a honeybee, after it emerges from the cell, will clean up its own cell, and it will work to keep clean the neighboring cells and keep brood warm. After about 3 to 5 days, it's old enough to where it's feeding the other larvae that are developing still. Then they tend to nurse bees. And this is, again, they're producing royal jelly, which is a very nutritious extract. It's a lot of vitamins, honey, proteins that they feed to the developing bees. After this, they're producing wax typically, so they can build new comb. And it takes about till their 18th day or so to where they're actually starting to fly and collect honey. And this can vary. You know, if you have some older bees, for whatever reason, the queen hasn't been laying eggs for a little bit, they can go back and produce wax. But this is not typical, and it's not, they don't produce as much. So, you know, younger bees produce more wax than older bees. So who is the queen? Queen, again, is a female bee. The queen will mate with drones, and she lays all the eggs. Having a queen in your hive releases pheromone, and this tells all the other bees within the hive that everything's fine and dandy. This slide, we're saying that queens live 2 to 4 years. That might be an average. That might be a little high also. You know, 1 to 2 years is not uncommon. You know, maybe 4, 5, 6 has happened. I don't hear much about bees, the queen living that long these days. So again, the queen has a lot of the same anatomy as the worker bees. Her stinger, though, does not have a barb on it. It's just a straight stinger, and this allows her to sting and then sting again later without dying. And we'll talk a little bit about what she does with her stinger in another slide here. So a queen will mate with 10 to 15 different drones from other colonies during a mating flight. I'm pausing here, Jamie.
That's fine.
I just want to make sure I'm on my slides here. Yeah. Okay. All right, I'm starting again. So a queen will mate with between 10 and 15 drones from different colonies. And when does this happen? So she emerges from her cell when she hatches. Her wings will dry out for a few days, and then she will leave the hive and mate with bees from another colony. So where does a queen bee come from? Queen bees are females just like the worker bees, but queen bees are fed a lot more of that royal jelly that we talked about during the initial stages of their development. And so they mature fully, their sexual organs develop fully, and that's what makes them a queen. So why don't all the bees become queens? And how do they determine this? Well, because she has this pheromone that she secretes throughout the hive, that suppresses the workers from overfeeding all the developing larvae. When they know that the queen has left, or that the queen, something's wrong with her, or that they want to swarm or some other conditions, then they will develop several cells into queen cells. So they have several queen cells going, and whichever one of those emerges first will go around and sting all the other queen cells so that there's still just one queen in the hive. So after she gets mated, she makes it back to the hive. The queen's going to start laying eggs. And she can lay 1 egg a minute, more or less. And she does this 24 hours a day. So that can add up to about 200,000 eggs a year. And that could be several thousand per day. Now, she doesn't always lay eggs at this pace, but at peak times a year, she can lay a lot of eggs. And she has to. Those worker bees don't live very long. They only live for about 6 weeks or so. So every 6 weeks, that queen has to replace the entire population of the hive. Now here's a picture of the queen being fed, being attended to by the workers. So here's a drone bee. Again, drone bees are males. They don't sting. They don't gather pollen or nectar. Their job is to mate. Their other job is also that they, again, release pheromone. And when there's males in a hive, generally speaking, you know that the hive's doing pretty well. Again, here's a drone on the comb. And like we said, one of their only jobs is to mate with a queen. And again, they don't have a stinger, but after they mate, they lose their endophallus, and then that bee dies. That also serves to kind of plug the queen up temporarily in order to spread this particular drone's genetics and kind of make it more difficult for other drones. So we just talked about the queen, the worker, and the drones. And this chart here, if there's one that you saved from this presentation, this is probably a pretty good one to keep. It takes 3 days until any egg actually hatches out. And then it's a larva for several days, capped cell for several days. It goes into the pupa state. And then the date that it emerges from the cell. Note that the queens emerge pretty quickly, whereas drones take a few extra days. But this is kind of an important thing to keep in the back of your head, that, when you get a new package of bees, or if you collect a swarm or whatever else, it's going to be 21 days before you have any new bees. And during that time period, the older bees that are in that hive are kind of dying off. So you're going to see a decline in population for a little bit. And it's also important that you know that there's some new bees coming. So when they talk about inspections, you're going to be looking for these eggs and these larvae. That way, a week or 2 or 3 from now, you have bees. These last couple slides here, I'm just going to talk about the life cycle of the hive. We were talking about individual bees. So what does the hive overall do? This is kind of a super organism, if you will, all these bees living together, working together. So early in the spring, you have a pretty small colony that made it through winter, or if you bought a package, you've got a relatively bees. And going into summer, there's a lot of flowers blooming. They're building up their colony size as quickly as they can. And, you know, getting more and more bees until maybe May or June. It depends when, but the hive ends up being pretty full. If this was a natural colony that's not being managed, they would be swarming at this point. And what's a swarm? That's when some of the bees leave the hive to form a new colony. This is how they reproduce in the wild and how they spread in the wild. So the queen bee, they'll actually stop feeding her so that she lightens up a little bit so she can fly. And during that same time period, the bees decide amongst themselves which cells to make new queens out of. There's a lot that goes into this. We could have a whole presentation, and I don't know, there might be one later, on this process of swarming and why they swarm. But the old queen and half of the hive, roughly, will leave the hive, and they will go out and look for a new place to live, while the bees that are left will make their new queen. She'll go out and mate with drones from another hive and come back and continue on the old hive, hopefully. The bees that left the colony, they're going to be hanging out in a tree someplace. I'm sure you've seen that or heard about it, a swarm of bees. And what they do is they hang out there in a ball until a beekeeper comes and picks them up, or until they find a hollow spot like your house, or a hollow tree, or maybe an empty beehive to move into. So that's kind of what they do in the wild, and they can do that in managed colonies as well until fall, that hopefully they've gathered up enough honey. They're going to eat that honey all winter. And the colony tends to, it depends on the species, get quite a bit smaller in the fall, and they'll overwinter with a small colony. And again, well, not again, I guess I haven't talked about during the winter, these bees will live inside the hive all winter. They don't hibernate. They don't fly south or anything. They live inside the colony. They actually keep that ball of bees warm through shivering, essentially. And they'll move around inside the colony in their little cluster, eating the honey. So they use the honey, not for you and me, but for their own food for the winter. And, you know, as long as they don't run out of honey, and as long as numerous other factors work out, they'll emerge in the spring to start the process over again. And I don't think I'm going to have any questions at this point. I think they'll address that later.